Good evening and a warm welcome to you all. My name is David Hewen, and from all of us at Garrett Publishing, it's such a delight that you could join us tonight. Before I introduce Mary Coloe and indeed hand over to her, we have some important items, if I may. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I join you from. I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd like to extend this respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait people from the many communities who may be with us on this Zoom tonight. The evening Zoom will be recorded. There are people who are unable to join us, but have registered. We'll have the video up on Garrett's website in coming days, and we'll send you a link out on the recording as soon as we can. On entering the Zoom today, your microphone has been muted. If not, please ensure your microphone is muted. For those of you who are familiar with Zoom, and I doubt many of you aren't, there is a chat function available. We would welcome any questions you have, so please note these in the chat, and we'll endeavour to have Mary respond to as many questions or comments during the evening. Mary Coloe is a professor of the New Testament at Yarra Theological Union, a college of the University of Divinity in Melbourne. Mary taught for over 20 years at Australian Catholic University, at Boston College, the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, and in Jerusalem. Mary has many academic publications on the Gospel of John, as well as books to help parents and teachers, such as A Friendly Guide to John, The Two Hands of God, and A Friendly Guide to the Birth of Jesus. Tonight's session is also a cause of celebration. Mary has worked hard over recent years to prepare, with our friends at Liturgical Press in the US, a 2-volume work in the extensive Wisdom Commentary series, and her books obviously are on John. Thank you, Mary, for your ongoing dedication and hard work in bringing the wisdom of John and the New Testament to the people of God. You are, and always will be, a treasure of the Universal Church. Mary, welcome, and thank you so much for your time. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining in tonight. It gives me great pleasure to share with you a project I've been working on since 2015. It's been a long pregnancy, but now it has come to birth. Back then I was asked to write a commentary on the Gospel of John, and it's for a feminist commentary series. At first I said no. I hadn't written explicitly from this perspective, and I wasn't sure I could, so I said no. But then I thought about it, and a week later I changed my mind because I felt ready to write a commentary on the whole Gospel, not just the bits I like, but the whole Gospel. So tonight that's what I'll be sharing with you, snippets from this work, and in this way introduce you to Divine Sophia, the feminine face of God. So I hope you can all see this beautiful image that is on the front of the commentary, the feminine face of God. You see, when Europeans arrived in Australia, they looked on the continent as Terra Nullius, and they rid the land of 60,000 years of habitation, culture, agriculture, song, art, technology, and eco-friendly living. The Aborigines were considered non-people, and until 1967 were not even counted in the census of Australian people. Their existence was numbered with the stock if they worked on cattle or sheep stations. Otherwise, they went unrecorded. The dark-skinned first people of this ancient land were made invisible and non-existent by European eyes. Women can resonate with this. The experience of many women requires the suffix less. Powerless, voiceless, moneyless, stateless, homeless. On the world stage, women seem to be constantly in the shadows of written his story, watching on as if non-existent. Their lives and experience were not worth recording. Within the limits of an ancient text that did emerge from a patriarchal social context, I want to invite women to take their place within the Johannine narrative. Now, some women appear as full characters and have primary roles, women such as the mother of Jesus, the woman of Samaria, Martha and Mary of Bethany, and Mary Magdalene. But other women seem to get lost in the crowd or submerged within the group of disciples. But this gospel, more than any other New Testament book, requires that all characters, women, men, Jew, Gentiles, all participate equally in the divinization of creation when the Word became flesh. The fundamental theology of the text is that all creation is open to be the tabernacling presence of God, and the commentary is written from this perspective. Methodologically, the analysis will involve two deliberate strategies. The first recognises that the Gospel draws on the Old Testament figure of Sophia, wisdom, in how it portrays Jesus. And although Sophia is not named, her place with God at the dawn of creation, her journey to tabernacle with humankind, her seeking disciples and making them friends of God and prophets, all of this resonates with the Johannine text. Jesus gives flesh and bones to wisdom's pilgrimage and task. So I begin each chapter with a brief text from the wisdom literature, so that her presence does not go unrecognised. The word wisdom is feminine in both Hebrew, Chokhmah, and Greek, Sophia. So this means that in the commentary it's appropriate to speak of Sophia and then use feminine pronouns such as she or her. While any language to speak of God is metaphorical, how we use language does shape our thinking and ideas. When so much of the Christian discourse has only used male imagery and then consistently spoken of God and prayed using the pronoun he, to name Sophia and bring the grammatically feminine language into theology challenges the absolute imaging of a male-only God and offers a corrective. More important than the grammar is the genre of the wisdom literature. When Sophia announces her presence, she doesn't make a declaration couched in metaphysical propositions or philosophy. Instead, Sophia sings. Ages ago, I was set up. At the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had been shaped and the hills, I was brought forth. Wisdom Sophia inhabits the places of women, and she acts as women do in setting her table and offering an invitation to her neighbours. So when we read in the Psalms that the voice of God thunders over the water, Sophia's voice invites, "Come, eat of my bread." While saying this, I'm not suggesting that Sophia is a timid shadow of God confined to the house. In Sirach and in Proverbs, her domain is the entire cosmos. And in the book of Wisdom, she is credited with Israel's salvation from Egypt and their deliverance in the Sinai wilderness. Wisdom's protective care of Israel is a power to be reckoned with. We read, "She drowned their enemies and cast them up from the depths of the sea," in Wisdom 10. The poetic genre of Wisdom's speech allows for free-ranging imagery and hyperbole. For feminist theologians, the maleness of Jesus is a difficulty. It brings a male specificity to God images and language. But when the divine Sophia is brought into any thinking about Jesus, then the male specificity does not restrict divine imagery and language to male only. Sophia breaks open the possibility for all women and men to find a place in divine friendship. That God became a particular human, Jesus, is called the scandal of particularity. Adding to this is a further scandalous realization that in various Second Testament and early church texts in which Jesus is celebrated as divine, Jesus is understood and celebrated as the female divine. The study of early Christian texts leads Sally Douglas to conclude, re-engaging with Jesus, Sophia wisdom, honours the heart of Christian identity, as the incarnation is central and it is Christ who saves. Yet, in recognising Jesus Sophia, ancient claims about Christ are able to be liberated from cultural habits of seeing that diminish their audacity. Wisdom Christology and wisdom soteriology are widely and wildly accessible. Images and symbols of Jesus Sophia have the potential to communicate with intensity and gripping power as they dissolve within themselves human constructed dualism between the divine and earth, between male and female, between the church and the world. Now, before venturing further into the gospel, I need to introduce Sophia. Most people are familiar from our liturgy with the stories from Genesis and Exodus. We might know stories from the books of Samuel about the rise of Saul and David. We regularly hear writings from prophets Isaiah, Hosea, and Jeremiah. But we are less familiar with the books known as the writings or wisdom. Each Sunday we hear a psalm, but other books are less frequently heard on a Sunday. 3 of these books, known as the wisdom literature, are very important for understanding the Gospel of John. One of the issues for ancient Israel was how to hold God's utter transcendence, utter being beyond the world, while also knowing God was immanent in the world. So the prophets spoke of the word of God coming to them. They didn't say God came to them. They said, the word of God came to me. Later writers chose the word wisdom as a way of speaking of God's presence in the world. God's wisdom was seen in the initial creation and then permeating the ordered cycles of nature. The sun rises and sets. The moon has phases, and seasons follow regularly. Perhaps not in Melbourne. And so we read in wisdom, "The Lord created me at the beginning of creation, the first of God's acts of long ago. Ages ago I was set up at first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had been shaped, and before the hills, I was brought forth. When God had not yet made earth and fields, or the world's first bits of soil. When the heavens were established, I was there. When God drew a circle on the face of the deep, and made firm the skies above. And when God established the fountains of the deep, and assigned the sea its limits, so that the waters might not transgress the boundaries. When God marked out the foundations of the earth, there I was beside God, like a master worker, or a darling child." The Hebrew word is ambiguous. "I was daily God's delight, rejoicing before God always, rejoicing in the inhabited world, and delighting in the human race." In Jewish thinking, Sophia, wisdom, looked for a place or a people with whom she could dwell, people who would value wisdom and want to walk in her ways. So the book of Sirach describes wisdom's quest. Now, this book is included in Catholic Bibles, but it's not in Protestant Bibles, where it's considered of secondary importance and called deuterocanonical. So here in this story of wisdom from the book of Sirach, you will hear echoes of words found in the Gospel. So, wisdom praises herself and tells of her glory in the midst of her people. In the assembly of the Most High she opens her mouth, and in the presence of his hosts she tells of her glory. "I came forth from the mouth of the Most High, and covered the earth like a mist. I dwelt in the highest heavens, and my throne was in a pillar of cloud. Alone I compassed the vault of heaven, and traversed the depths of the abyss. Over waves of the sea, over all the earth, and over every people and nation I have held sway. Among all these I sought a resting place, in whose territory should I abide. Then the Creator of all things gave me a command. My Creator chose the place for my tent. God said, 'Make your dwelling in Jacob, and in Israel receive your inheritance.' Before the ages, in the beginning, God created me, and for all ages I shall not cease to be. In the holy tabernacle I ministered, and so I was established in Zion. Thus, in the beloved city, God gave me a resting place, and Jerusalem was my domain. I took root in an honoured people, in the portion of the Lord's heritage. So come to me, you who desire me, and eat your fill of my fruits, for the memory of me is sweeter than honey, the possession of me sweeter than the honeycomb. Those who eat of me will hunger for more, and those who drink of me will thirst for more." So Sophia finds a home in Israel, particularly in the temple in Jerusalem. Living wisely according to the path of Sophia was seen as living a faithful, righteous life, and ultimately the path of wisdom was identified with the Jewish Torah. So Sirach continues, "All this is the book of the covenant of the Most High God, the law that Moses commanded us, as an inheritance for the congregations of Jacob. Through the immanent ordering of Sophia in the cosmos and in daily life, Israel found a way of expressing God as transcendent and yet close, present in their midst. This is the theology that the Gospel of John draws on to speak of Jesus, introduced first as God's Word, or in Greek, the Logos. But if you listen hard, you'll hear echoes of wisdom, because like wisdom, the Word was present in the beginning with God, and through the Word all creation came into being. We read that the Word came to his own people, his own creation. And then we're told that the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. So the Word is described in a way very similar to divine Sophia, coming to dwell in Israel in the Holy Tabernacle. And like wisdom, there are varied responses to the Word. Some reject him, and some accept. And those who accept are given the promise to be made children of God. So when John was trying to find a way of speaking about Jesus in his divinity and his mortal humanness, John looked back to these scriptures and found in the wisdom theology a way of presenting Jesus as God incarnate. And when the narrative starts, the gospel narrative, similarities continue. So Jesus, like wisdom, gathers disciples, inviting them to dwell with her. Jesus offers them nourishment, as wisdom does, and salvation. The disciples of wisdom are called children and friends of God. Wisdom lives with God, is loved by God. She is an initiate in the knowledge of God and an associate in his works. So I conclude this brief overview with words of another scholar who wrote, "Wisdom strides through the Gospel of John in the person of Jesus. Jesus is Sophia incarnate, God reaching out to humanity to the fullest extent as a human being." Now, I want to look at a couple of places in the Gospel where this wisdom theology is, to my mind, extraordinarily obvious. Early in the narrative, in chapter 3, Jesus encounters Nicodemus. And in the dialogue and discourse which follow, the Gospel uses words that are unique to the Book of Wisdom. They're not found anywhere else in the Old Testament. So John is obviously drawing on the Book of Wisdom. So in this discussion, Jesus says to Nicodemus, "Truly I tell you, no one can see the reign of God." Now the Greek says the basileia to theou, the kingdom or reign of God, without being born anew. Nicodemus doesn't understand this and says, "How can anyone be born after having grown old? Can one enter a second time into a mother's womb and be born?" And Jesus answers, "Truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom, the reign of God, without being born of water and the Spirit. What is born of the flesh is flesh. What is born of the Spirit is spirit." Now, the minute we see being born of water and the Spirit, sometimes people immediately think of baptism, when really John is writing about being born of a human mother, being born when a mother's waters break. That's what being born of water means. Being born of the flesh, being born into human life. And a second birth is possible, being born of the Spirit. And when you're born of the Spirit, you enter into a new quality of life. That new quality of life is called in the gospel eternal life, or as I translate it, eternity life, because it is a quality of life. It's not just life going on and on and on forever. It's God's life. So we read, this is still chapter 3, just after Nicodemus, God so loved the world, God gave the only born Son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but may have eternity life. Now this expression, eternity life, like the word the kingdom of God, is only found in the book of wisdom. And John draws on this wisdom theology to make that gift of eternity life a present reality, as it is in the book of wisdom. Then, throughout the gospel, that phrase, eternity life, continues and is used again and again and again. So this eternity life phrase clarifies what it means to be born again, to be born into the reign of God. And then this motif of eternity life is a major motif across the entire narrative. And every time we hear that word eternity life, we need to see it speaking about birth. And so it's hard not to see Sophia in this passage about birth and whenever eternity life is mentioned. At the cross, the image of being born again is graphically shown in birthing image, when blood and water flow from the side of Sophia Jesus. You can see the text. His side is pierced and blood and water come out. As I argue in the commentary, this is a birth moment. It's the moment when disciples are born as children of God. And the gospel confirms that this is a birth moment when in the resurrection story Jesus says to Mary Magdalene, "Go to my brothers and sisters and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." So disciples are no longer called disciples. They're now brothers and sisters of Jesus, and therefore they're children of God. Those who accept Jesus and receive the gift of the Spirit are born of God and can now be called God's children. That first creative act of God is brought to completion in Jesus' death and the release of the Spirit. But that ushers in the dawn of a new creation. So this action of piercing the side of Jesus appears to be a confirmation of death. In fact, from a Johannine perspective, it's a moment of birth. Now, in case you think I'm making all this up, or this is just crazy feminist stuff, I want you to know that this notion of birth at the cross is a very ancient insight. So I've called this ancient wisdom. It's not simply a modern feminist invention. Clement of Alexandria, less than 100 years after the gospel, wrote about the body of Christ which nourishes by the word the young brood, which the Lord himself brought forth in throes of flesh, which the Lord himself swathed in his precious blood. Oh, amazing birth! And similarly, Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, refers to Christ as the Virgin who bore us, who fed us with her own milk. And in the Sirach tradition, there is a comparison made between Adam's side that gave birth to Eve and the pierced side of Jesus that gave birth to the church. So in the 6th century, Jacob, Bishop of Serugh, wrote this: "From the beginning, God knew and depicted Adam and Eve in the likeness of the image of his only begotten. He slept on the cross, as Adam had slept his deep sleep. His side was pierced, and from it there came forth the daughter of light, water and blood, as an image of divine children, to be heirs to the Father, who loves his only begotten." The image of Jesus' death as birth to new life offers rich theological and pastoral possibilities. One is that it enables female disciples to identify more fully with Jesus Sophia, the Creator and Spirit. Gender boundaries are blurred and transcended in the images presented of Jesus, who gives birth to a renewed people of God, Jesus who births believers, and of the Spirit, through whom believers are born again from above. Here I must say that sometimes the translation hide the birth language. They speak of Jesus as the only Son, whereas the Greek says the only born, and it uses the language of birth, not generation, but birth as if born from a woman. This metaphor enables us to understand Jesus' self-gift as similar to that of lovers who choose to make painful sacrifices out of love for the other, a pain able to be endured because of that love and because of the new life that will result. Unlike the kinds of economic transactions between God and humanity that are implied in sacrificial and ransom metaphors, the birthing image evokes an exchange of love that is mutual and self-replicating. Yes, in teaching John, I teach my students the model of salvation in John is not redemption, is not ransom, is not atonement. It's a model of love unto death. It's a model of liberation. There's something rather unique about this commentary series. The authors deliberately invite other voices to contribute. Most commentaries don't do that. Usually a commentary is a single voice. These different voices can offer an alternative or a complementary voice. It's an attempt to show that no one person has absolute truth, that we need to work together, to work in relationship with others, not in competition. And so in this commentary, I've invited Dorothy Lee from Melbourne to contribute her perspective on the language of God as Father, which is very dominant in John. I asked Ruth Sheridan, a Jewish woman, to write on how the Jews are presented in John, and Sandra Schneiders to write on the importance of symbolism. Elizabeth Schrader has done fascinating work on Martha and Mary of Bethany. Kathleen Rushton from New Zealand writes from the very painful experience of earthquake-prone New Zealand. Kathleen and Margaret Daly-Denton of England bring a specifically earth-centred awareness. And Rekha Shinatu from India writes on the vine and branches as a covenant community of friends. Two very important contributors were Mary Ann Beavis from Canada and Barbara Reed from Chicago. They were my go-to editors when my thinking needed to be challenged and stretched. They kept asking for more. They raised questions. How can this be liberating for women? They challenged me to trust my own voice and not keep looking back to male scholars to provide evidence of support for an approach I was taking. I learnt much from them. Now, I've spoken about one deliberate strategy, which was to bring Sophia to the foreground and to show the use of the wisdom tradition in the presentation of Jesus in the Gospel of John. A second interpretive strategy was a Jewish strategy, akin to the Jewish tradition of Midrash. You see, many of the Gospel scenes are painted in monochrome, with only men visible. The presence of women is either taken for granted, forgotten, or unrecognised, and here Midrash is needed. A Jewish feminist theologian wrote, "Midrash expands and burrows. It invents the forgotten and prods the memory, takes from history and asks for more. It gives us the inner life history that history cannot follow." She also speaks of the contradiction between the holes in the text and many women's felt experience. So, rather than continue the sins of my white European ancestors and see Terra Nullius, my reading insists on a text inhabited by women as well as men. I draw Sophia to the foreground and bring women's discipleship out of the shadows. Now, I must say, the commentary coming all the way from America, it's hardback, it's costly. Not only does it have to pay freight, but also the government puts on GST, and I can't do anything about this. All I can say is that it's taken 6 years of work, and volume 1 is out, and in 2 weeks' time the second volume will also be out. And I'd be looking at next year, early next year, at having a proper launch. So, David, that's all I have to say. So over to you. Oh, and I am happy to take any questions you've got.
Oh, Mary, thank you very much. There are a couple of comments and some questions, so
Okay.
I will pass those on in a moment.
Right.
Just to reiterate, if I may, because a number of people joined after we began.
Oh.
And came in a bit later than the 7 o'clock. So I just want to reassure those people that we have been recording tonight's session and that a video link will be sent to you tomorrow. So if you happen to arrive a little later than you would have liked, or got mixed up with the times, given a number of people came in at about 7:30, so they might have been mixed up with daylight savings, be assured that you will get the session either tomorrow or Friday, depending on how busy the Garrett team are with other bits and bobs. Can I also make mention that we are at Garrett doing our very best to actually get the books, the wisdom books, printed here locally in Australia. We like to do that where we can, so that saves freight. It's better for the environment because we're not bringing books in across the Pacific. It's very difficult in COVID times to do that. But if people do order the books, there may be a delay, but we are doing everything that we can to work with the US publishers to allow them to allow us to print them locally, which would speed the whole process up. So just there are quite a number of, or there's a number of questions that have started to come through, but I might start with the first and work down if I may.
Yeah, certainly, David.
And I appreciate everybody. You've all been so fantastic being muted. So well done to everybody. Bob Munro mentioned, as I listen, could it be that Sophia of the Old Testament equates to the Holy Spirit, Mary?
In the Gospel, Sophia equates more to Jesus. So Jesus is the one we see acting as Sophia, not the Spirit. So that could be another spirituality. But in John's Gospel, I'd say no. Jesus is much more the Sophia character. There's a question here too, David, I notice about the language of Father, which is very strong in John.
Yes.
And it's why I asked Dorothy Lee to write a little bit about the Father image. And she does it beautifully. She says, the way the Father is spoken of in John totally deconstructs a patriarchal Father image. The Father is one who gives away power, who surrenders, who is vulnerable. So it's not a patriarchal Father image. So that's just a very brief answer. And yes, the question here is it does emphasise a relational. That's the trouble with language. We want to use personal language of God to relate to God in a personal way, not just as an impersonal abstraction. But if we only restrict our language to masculine words, then we lose sight of the feminine God, the birthing God, the God who carried us as a child, who nurses us. So we need to expand our language. I'm just looking through some of these others.
So I've got Anna has said, this is so great, but the church today seems a long way from recognising this wisdom.
Yep.
How can we reclaim the feminine wisdom model and language in our church today?
Oh my
It's
God.
a very big question.
I don't know. I don't know that I could even attempt to answer it because
that's a session in itself, Mary.
Well, look, it seems to me, I sometimes have to say, I talk about the boys' club.
Really?
I do. I know I'm naughty and I shouldn't, but that's what it seems, as if it's a little club and it doesn't want to let anyone else in, like the Melbourne Club, doesn't want to let any women in. And it's very hard to break down. What I do see, though, is women simply walking away and finding an alternative, creating an alternative, creating communities that are prayerful, that are supportive, that are mission-oriented, that are Eucharistic.
Yes.
They gather with symbol, with thanksgiving in their hearts and with the presence of Jesus.
Well, you recently did a session with Women Preach, didn't you?
I did, yes.
Just maybe last month or the month before.
That's right, because as I said then, look, I teach boys how to preach, but I'm not allowed to preach myself, which is a bit silly. Then I have to sit through nonsense.
We probably need to have another whole panel of experts answer that question.
Yeah.
But thank you very much. Patricia has got a comment here that you might like to respond to.
Yeah, it's just
Mary.
about Eucharist.
Yeah, I've often thought that
Yeah,
the Mass, altar, wine, water, bread is a ritualization of a woman nurturing her children from her own self.
yep.
Um, so I heard you say that Mary birthed wisdom in the shape of Jesus, who birthed us on the cross. Now we remember this at Mass. Do you have a response to that at all, Mary?
I actually do a little, what I call an excursus, after John 6. John 6 is the chapter about the bread of life. And of course, it also moves into talking about eating my flesh, drinking my blood, very Eucharistic language. And I think it's hard for any woman to engage with Eucharist without finding it painful. So I needed to write a little bit about women and Eucharist. And yeah, I said all sorts of things, probably won't get excommunicated, but I said this at the end. The very clear Johannine theology of Jesus embodying Sophia could and should remove gender issues from considering Eucharistic leadership. If gender is to be significant, then surely only women who know the experience of bearing, birthing, and nurturing a child can say with any realism, "This is my body given for you." Only women can act in persona Sophia. Now, I'll probably get excommunicated for that, but it's what I think. Women in a very particular way, particularly mothers, and I'm not a mother. But there's a generativity, though, I think, in my teaching.
Mary, if it's any consolation, it doesn't seem there's any bishops, archbishops, cardinals, or popes joining us today, unless they are doing it by stealth.
Okay.
So you should be okay.
Yep. They could be there hiding behind the name Patricia.
Yes, this is true. Highly unlikely, but you never know. Just trying to go through the comments. Given all the Anne has said, given all the connections to Sophia in John's Gospel,
right?
Why does John use logos when he could have said
Sophia?
In the beginning was Sophia, and Sophia was with God?
Yeah, great question, Anne. And I think really it's because of the maleness of Jesus. And logos in Greek has masculine gender. Logos masculine, Sophia feminine. And so in talking about in the beginning was the word logos, it leads itself to then saying the word became flesh and then talking about Jesus. That's as much of a guess as I can make of it. It's the connection between the maleness of Jesus and the language. It's interesting, though, because in the Palestinian lectionary, they're called Targums. The lectionary actually says, "In the beginning, with wisdom, God created the heavens and the earth." All right, so it's really important that the Targums, the Aramaic writing of the scriptures, put wisdom there in the beginning. In the beginning, with wisdom, God created the heavens and the earth. So, but I do think the Logos language is there primarily because of the maleness of Jesus, you know.
There's a question, could you, from Andrea Dean, hello, Andrea, could you say a bit more about the cover image, Mary?
Yeah, there it is. Every volume in this commentary series has this cover. So whether it's writing about Ephesians or Deuteronomy, they all have this cover. And it's a painting by Mary Southard. And it's called Women's Wisdom dancing. And she writes about it, the image emerged while I was at Spirit Mountain for an extended time of reflection. So I painted the feminine relationship of maiden, mother, and crone. And there was a lot of energy generated in me, and it was quite a circular grounding in soil, in earth, in moon and sky. So that's Mary Southard's image, and it's a beautiful image, and that's the one I was using on the slides. Is there a connection between Mary and wisdom in John? No. The main wisdom character in John is Jesus. Okay? Jesus is the one who does the things wisdom does, even speaks in parables as wisdom speaks. So, yeah, it's much more Jesus-centred. Mary, can I say a bit more about the birthing? That would take another session.
Well, I'm sure that the 400 plus people, Mary, would join us again for such a session. So beware what you say. They might hold you to such a session.
Well, see, in the New Testament, there are many ways of trying to make sense of the cross. What was God doing in the crucifixion? Paul uses images, many of them. He likens it to God buying back people who were enslaved to evil, just as somebody goes to the market and buys a slave at the market. That's one image. Or the ransom language of Anselm, or atonement language from Judaism. There are many, many, many images. Somewhere in our history, and I think it really does go back to Anselm, we got stuck on one. So we focused on one image that made sense to people at that time. It doesn't make sense to me any longer. Maybe when I was 8 it did. It all seemed very nicely balanced, but it doesn't make sense now. So it's good to look at the New Testament and see, well, what are some of the other images? And John certainly provides another image to talk about what Jesus was doing. And in John 10, Jesus speaks of the good shepherd willing to lay down his life for his sheep. He says to the disciples, greater love has no one than to lay down their life for their friends. So it's not a ransom, it's not atonement, it's not a legalistic thing, it's about love. It's really about love. Greater love has no one. Okay,
Mary,
yeah.
I'm quite conscious of the time.
Yeah, me too.
And there are a number of other comments.
Yep.
Many of them recognise your work, congratulate you for your work.
Yeah, thank you.
And they thank us for putting these sessions on. And we collectively, we thank you so much for doing so. A couple of things, if I may. The first thing is, as often is the case with our Zoom series, we're running them with Yarra Theological College. And if you would like, if you are able, and if you'd like to make a donation to Yarra to continue their work, I know the folks at Yarra, including Mary, would very graciously accept a small donation or a large donation, whatever you could make.
Yeah.
Now, tomorrow, when we send out the link to this email, we will also include some bank details for Yarra Theological College.
Yarra Theological Union.
Union, sorry, I beg your pardon, of the College of Divinity. I do apologise for that, Mary.
That's okay.
But there is no obligation. These sessions are free to all. And we thank that. If, of course, you would also, if you'd like to support Mary's works, you can visit garrett.com.au or garrettpublishing.com.au and buy any or all of Mary's extensive works from us. Alternatively, contact your local bookshop. Local bookshops have been doing it hard for years, but let alone in COVID times. So if you have a local bookshop that you'd like to support, then contact them and see if you can purchase Mary's books through them.
It is available as an ebook, by the way.
Yes. Yeah, I was about to say the ebook is available shortly. Yes. I'm not sure whether you can click on the button today, but it won't be too far off.
Yeah, our library has got it as an ebook.
Right. Excellent. The other point, just to believe it or not, Mary, there are still people coming on to the session now. Oh. So I fear daylight saving stuffs people everywhere, particularly the Queenslanders.
Yeah.
Again, I'll just reinforce the fact that we have recorded the session tonight. You will get the link. So if you feel at the very end you've just joined and hearing us saying goodbyes, that you've missed out, please be aware that we have recorded the session and we will send you the link as soon as we can. So Mary, lots of thank yous coming through for your work. So maybe before I finish up and switch everybody off abruptly, I wish to thank you for tonight. It's been fantastic, as always. Garrett will continue to run these sessions. We have Mary back again in a few weeks' time. We're running a 4-week program on Advent. So please join us. We will send you some details of those in coming weeks. So we're looking forward to those. We also have a really strong idea of some similarly biblical and other sessions scheduled for next year. So whilst we might be out of the COVID dramas that Melbourne and Canberra and Sydney have been in recently, what we found is this is a great way to connect with all of you, and we find that it's a great way for you to connect with your faith in ways that you perhaps we didn't even think of a few years ago. So it's been great. So on behalf of Garrett Publishing, on behalf of Mary, I again thank you, and I'm sure everybody agrees. The notes coming through are amazing. The hands are clapping. Everybody, please travel safely, journey safely wherever you may be travelling to over the next few days. Mary's heading down to Mornington for a break out of Melbourne. And many other people are probably travelling near or far. But blessings to all of you. And we look forward to seeing you again very shortly. And believe it or not, I'm just about to admit Father John, who's come in just a little bit late.
He sure has.
So he won't miss out. Father John, if you've just joined us, you won't miss out. We have recorded the session. And so has Edward's just come on as well, believe it or not. So we're up to about 450 people joined us tonight.
Oh dear, oh dear.
David, just before you wrap up, I'd like to let Mary know that I was speaking to Frank Maloney this afternoon, and he sends his best wishes, and he assured me that I'd enjoy the night very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Indeed. All right, I'm going to log off now and wish you all the best. Thank you for joining us. Mary, again, thank you very much.
Okay.
Good night.
Thank you all.